We are in June of the year 1940. The whole of France was conquered in an unprecedented blitzkrieg campaign in just 6 weeks, and the French government capitulated in Paris. However, instead of carrying out a complete military occupation of the entire country, the Nazi regime chose a different path, which initially seemed quite unusual, namely, the partition of France. This decision resulted in a divided nation, with the northern part under direct German control, while the southern part fell under the administration of the Vichy government, a puppet regime led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. But why didn't Hitler occupy the whole of France? Why did he divide the country, and how free was the Vichy government really? We take a look at all these fascinating questions in today's video. After the traumatic experiences of the extremely brutal trench warfare in France during the First World War, Germany opted for the tactic of blitzkrieg in the Second World War. Fast, surprising and combined attacks by infantry, tanks and artillery were intended to break through the defensive lines in order to advance as quickly as possible to Paris. And the tactic worked surprisingly well, as the Germans actually reached Paris just a few weeks after the outbreak of the campaign and were thus able to dictate an armistice on their terms. The incredibly fast and threatening advance of the Wehrmacht quickly diminished hopes of victory in France. And so not only was the government deposed, but it was also decided extremely quickly to lay down arms. On the 16th of June in the year 1940, the conquest of Paris resulted in the replacement of the Reynaud government by Philippe Pétain. The latter declared that the continuation of the war was hopeless, and only a few days later he made himself available for armistice negotiations. And so, in the heart of the Compiègne forest, in a railroad carriage, an armistice was agreed that decided the future of France. The railroad carriage was not chosen at random. To further humiliate their enemy, the Nazis chose the same railroad carriage that had already served as the setting for an armistice during the First World War, when Germany surrendered to France. The Armistice of Compiègne thus officially marked the end of hostilities between Germany and France. However, the conditions for France were severe. In the following, we will look at just a few points of the treaty. Firstly, there was the severe disarmament of the French army. This was to be reduced to a contingent of no more than 100,000 men in order to maintain public order. The remaining troops were to be disarmed and demobilized. In return, it was agreed that German occupation troops would be stationed, with France bearing the costs of housing and supplying these troops. Hundreds of thousands of French soldiers taken prisoner during the Blitzkrieg were not to be handed over, but were to remain as German prisoners of war. The French fleet was to be demobilized and stationed in French ports under French control to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Allies. France was to cooperate economically with Germany, which primarily involved compulsory levies and economic concessions. And France pledged not to continue fighting against Germany or its allies, nor to provide support to countries that did. But the most important point was probably the territorial change. The armistice provided for a division of French territory. While the northern and western parts of the country were occupied by German troops, the southern part remained under the control of the French government, which would later become known as the Vichy government. This move initially seemed very unusual for Hitler, who was actually obsessed with controlling as much land as possible himself and expanding Germany as far as possible on the map. But there were numerous objective reasons for this. Hitler was planning a long, sustained war, and he needed his troops and resources on numerous other fronts in Europe. By not occupying the entire French territory, Germany was able to save considerable military resources that would otherwise have been needed to occupy and administer such a large area. But there were also economic reasons for the decision. By keeping part of France under the administration of the Vichy government, a certain economic stability and productivity could be maintained, which benefited Germany. The unoccupied part of France could continue to function as an economic unit, producing valuable goods and services for the German war effort. And the important industrial centers in the north of the country remained under direct German control, whereas the Vichy region served to supply goods, primarily agricultural, needed for the German war effort without the need for direct control. But there were also security reasons. By maintaining a French administrative structure, Germany was better able to counter potential internal security problems, such as uprisings and resistance movements, by using the French police and other authorities to enforce order. And by not occupying the whole of France, Germany was still able to give the appearance, at least in part, that it had no intention of a world war. The existence of the Vichy government also allowed Germany to maintain formal diplomatic relations with a nominally independent French state, which kept diplomatic options and channels open. But in reality, of course, southern France had little say of its own. But in addition to the two main zones, there were also other fragmentations of France. So what did the division look like in detail? First of all, of course, the zone occupied by Germany. This comprised the northern and western part of France, including the entire Atlantic coast with its important naval bases. The region was directly under the control of the German military administration. And the capital Paris was also located in this zone. Then there was the unoccupied zone, also known as the Free Zone, which included the south of France. This was administered by the French government based in Vichy under the leadership of Marshal Philippe Pétain. Although this zone wanted to appear autonomous to the outside world, it was very strongly influenced and controlled by the Germans. But there was also an Italian zone. After the Armistice of Compiègne, Fascist Italy, which was Germany's main ally, occupied a small part of southeastern France, including Nice and Corsica. A forbidden zone was also introduced. This affected some areas, particularly on the north coast. These zones were inaccessible to most French people because the Germans had built military fortifications and other strategic installations there. It is also important to mention the demarcation line, which ran right across the country. This clear line separated the occupied and unoccupied zones. And in order to cross this line, special passports or permits were required, which were difficult to obtain. Similar to the demarcation lines between North and South Korea today. Ultimately, around 40% of French territory plus the entire French colonies were subject to the Vichy regime. But even though the citizens there initially seemed to be better off, as they escaped the brutal reprisals and persecution by the Germans, the German influence on southern France grew stronger and stronger as the war progressed. As a result, political persecution and the deportation of Jews also took place there. This led to the formation of a resistance, which mainly operated underground and gathered information, carried out sabotage operations and later supported the Allied forces in their liberation. In November of the year 1942, a decisive turning point was reached. The Allies carried out the so-called Operation Torch, a simultaneous amphibious landing in several key areas of North Africa, including Casablanca, Oran and Algiers, and a subsequent conquest of North Africa. This not only weakened the Vichy regime but also liberated numerous colonies. And the operation served as a springboard to Italy. Many soldiers and politicians of the Vichy regime had switched sides during the North African offensive and now supported the Allies. As this was naturally a thorn in the side of the Germans, a short time later they also occupied the south of France militarily. Officially, the Vichy government remained sovereign, but the newly occupied territory was now placed under the control of a German commander of the Army of Southern France, and the French army was completely disarmed. And the occupation was to continue for almost 2 more years. It was not until D-Day that France was gradually liberated from the Allies. And with the surrender of the German troops in France on the occasion of the liberation of Paris on the 24th of August in the year 1944, the occupation officially came to an end.